In the early summer of 1914, the world still believed that distance provided safety. Oceans separated continents, borders seemed permanent, and wars, when they occurred, were expected to remain regional, contained by geography and diplomacy. Few imagined that a single conflict could bind humanity into one shared catastrophe. Yet when the First World War erupted in Europe, that belief collapsed with astonishing speed. Within weeks, the war crossed seas, leapt across continents, and reached every corner of the globe. This was the day the world became connected by war. The conflict began with a single act of violence in the Balkans, but its true causes ran far deeper. Europe's great powers had spent decades building rival alliances, expanding militaries, and competing for influence. When diplomacy failed, mobilization plans took over. Armies marched, railways moved millions, and declarations of war followed one after another. What leaders expected to be a short, decisive struggle instead became a chain reaction, one that no government could stop once it began. These powers were not confined to Europe. They ruled vast empires that stretched across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Britain, France, Germany, and others controlled colonies through trade routes, naval bases, and communication networks that spanned the world. When war came, it did not remain a European affair. It followed the pathways of empire, transforming distant lands into battlegrounds and drawing millions of people into a conflict they did not choose. Colonial soldiers were among the first to experience this transformation. From India, North and West Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, men were recruited or conscripted to fight for imperial causes. Many had never left their homeland before. They were sent to foreign continents, unfamiliar climates, and brutal front lines. European battlefields became multinational spaces, where languages, uniforms, and cultures mixed in the trenches. The war was no longer fought by nations alone, but by empires. The oceans, once barriers that separated civilizations, became highways of conflict. Naval power now determined survival. Merchant ships carried food, coal, oil, and raw materials across thousands of miles, sustaining armies far from home. At the same time, submarines hunted these lifelines in silence, turning shipping lanes into killing zones. A single torpedo could ripple through economies and front lines continents away. Even the ocean floor became part of the battlefield. Undersea telegraph cables, thin strands of wire connecting governments, militaries, and markets, were cut in the opening days of the war. Entire regions were suddenly isolated, unable to communicate with their rulers. Information, once a tool of commerce, became a weapon. Control of communication meant control of strategy, diplomacy, and morale. In Asia, the war triggered a dramatic shift in global power. Japan entered the conflict as an ally of Britain, but with ambitions of its own. German ports and island holdings in the Pacific were seized quickly, often with little resistance. These actions reshaped trade routes and naval dominance across the region. Without fighting massive battles, Japan expanded its influence and emerged from the war stronger than it had entered. The conflict connected Asia directly to the global balance of power, setting the stage for future rivalries. Africa, too, was drawn into the struggle, though its story was often overlooked. German colonies became targets as Allied forces advanced through jungles, deserts, and remote interiors. Warfare in Africa was less about decisive battles and more about endurance. The true burden fell on African civilians, especially porters forced to carry supplies through extreme conditions. Disease, exhaustion, and starvation claimed countless lives. Africa paid a devastating price for a war decided far beyond its shores. The Middle East experienced changes even more profound. Strategic railways, vital waterways, and emerging oil resources turned the region into a key theater of war. Revolts were encouraged, alliances reshaped, and promises made to competing groups, often without intention of being honored. As empires weakened and collapsed, borders were drawn by distant powers with little regard for local realities. The consequences of these decisions would echo for generations, long after the war ended. Technology ensured that no front existed in isolation. Industrial production became as important as battlefield success. Factories across Europe and North America worked without pause, producing weapons, ammunition, and equipment on an unprecedented scale. Agriculture became strategic. A shortage of food in one country could weaken armies thousands of miles away. Civilians were no longer spectators. Through labor, rationing, and industry, entire societies became part of the war effort. For the first time in history, war was experienced as a truly shared global event. News traveled faster than armies. Reports of victories, defeats, and disasters spread across continents, shaping public opinion and political decisions. A naval loss in one ocean could influence morale on another continent. No nation, no matter how distant, was untouched by the consequences of the fighting. Neutrality itself became fragile. Global trade networks meant that even countries not officially at war felt the economic and political pressure. Blockades disrupted markets. Refugees crossed borders. Diplomacy became increasingly difficult in a world where every action had global repercussions. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. The world had become too connected. When the fighting finally ended in 1918, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had entered the war. Empires had expanded, collapsed, or been fatally weakened. New powers rose. Old certainties vanished. Yet the connections forged by war did not disappear with peace. Instead, they tightened. Economies remained linked. Political tensions hardened. Grievances festered. The First World War did more than kill millions. It transformed how humanity understood conflict itself. War was no longer local or regional. It was systemic, global, and interconnected. Decisions made in one capital could determine the fate of distant populations. Technology, industry, and empire ensured that future conflicts would only grow more expansive. This was not just the first industrial war or the first modern war. It was the first moment when humanity realized that in an interconnected world, no conflict is ever distant. On that day, as war spread across oceans and continents, the world crossed a threshold from which it could never return. This was the day the world became connected by war, and history would never again be confined by borders.